Sandy and Nora's podcast.
Hey, Nora.
Hey, Sandy.
You want Jonathan K to guzzle what now?
Sorry, I want him to?
Well, I presume you want him to. You issued a command. If that's a command that you have issued, you supposedly desire such command to be fulfilled.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So folks, not following along on Twitter. So I told Jonathan K to guzzle diarrhea, and about 400 people agreed.
But I think the reason why you told him to do that is something that we should mention this week, and we'll get into it a little bit more later. But before we do, how are you? How you doing?
I'm great. I feel like there's so much news going on, and it was like, ooh, what are all the things we should talk about? Oh, that. So this episode is going to be a grab bag of news, though we might, I don't know, have a central anchoring issue by the time we get to the end of it. But the amount of news, that's how I feel right now. I feel like I'm very oppressed by how much is going on in my life. There
is certainly quite a bunch of news happening, and I'm sorry you're feeling that way. And yeah, I get it. I'm feeling like the weight of all of the things too. But you know what? It is the beginning of summer, and hopefully, I guess it's not the beginning of summer. It's the fucking middle of June. How did that happen? When did that happen? Hopefully the sun is out and helps to elevate your mood at some point.
Yeah, not over here. It's not. But you know what? Fuck the sun. All right. I haven't seen the sun in like 4 weeks, so I don't need that shit.
Oh, wow. That's aggressive. Okay.
Yeah. Well, what can I say?
Well, maybe what will improve your mood is thanking some folks. How's about that?
Yeah, of course. I think that will improve my mood. And this week we have thanks to give out to one person. So, hey, Sinead, thanks so much for your support. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sinead. Okay, so we've got a bundle of things to discuss today. Where shall we start? Shall we start with the reason why you were telling Jonathan K to guzzle diarrhea? How do you come up with this stuff? I don't understand.
Oh, Sandy, my brain is mysterious. It's mysterious and always turning.
Look, I know that about you, and I know that many people found that quite entertaining, and I'm just like, man, that's not even close to your best material, but...
No, it's so basic. It's like, what do you say to someone like Jonathan K? It's like that. That's what you say to him.
It's awful.
Okay, yes. Why was I telling Jonathan K to guzzle diarrhea? Well, Sandy, did you hear what I think is like the biggest news in Canada of the last week? But I pause saying that because I'm not sure. I'm not sure it is. If you take a whirl through the websites of the news organizations in this country, 15 people died in a bus accident with a truck, a collision at the intersections of Highway 5 and the Trans-Canada in Carberry, Manitoba. And I was telling this to Jonathan K because someone responded me to show me the front page of the Globe and Mail this week. And Sandy, I mean, you're going to guess, of course, the front page had a mention of this crash. But what do you think the front page was about?
I don't know. Maybe the Supreme Court decision on the Safe Third Country Agreement.
Another topic that we will be talking about in a second. Nope.
Was it potentially, did it have something to do with the Ukrainian offensive?
No, not even that.
What could it possibly have been? I mean, there's so much news this week. Perhaps some continued news on the fires.
Well, it's the Globe and Mail's weekend newspaper. So it's a time to feature on the front page of the most significant newspaper of the week, of the most significant newspaper in Canada, something really, really important. And they went with...
I get it. I know what it must be.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The international student fight to stop the deportations and how they won.
Another topic that we're going to hit on tonight. No. They had a feature on hockey cards and collecting hockey cards and
You
loving.
what?
them. Yeah.
Hockey
Yeah.
cards?
Hockey
cards that
cards,
people
yeah.
collect?
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
what
some-
we used to do in the early 1990s?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That is the feature because no one died in a bus crash? Because there wasn't a massive Supreme Court decision?
Yeah.
I don't understand how that could possibly be the feature in a week like this.
Yeah. So here we are. And as you might expect, I've heard from a lot of people. I've had emails and I've had messages and replies online demanding to know what I think about this, but in a very aggressive and hostile way, as if to say, like, I was wrong 5.5 years ago when I made comments about people, the donations to the Humboldt Bronco bus crash being very high, and how it's too bad that that kind of generosity is not extended to other kinds of victims. And here we have it, the weekend edition of the Globe and Mail, which had enough time, of course, between the crash and the publication, featuring hockey cards when 15 people were killed in a bus accident in Western Canada. I mean, it's just like, yeah, if I was going to write the story of my life, it would be just too obvious to add this like footnote to that and say, where's the hockey sticks on everyone's door, the candles in the window, or the names of the victims?
I mean, yeah, it is quite a telling, like, weird decision that does talk about how much this country values hockey and the way that it, considers hockey over the lives of people who are not deemed valuable by society. And certainly for those of you who haven't heard about this news, it's massive news. It's international news that this crash happened that killed 15 people. Most of these people, or all of these people, I believe, were seniors, although they have not yet released the names of the people who died. There were 25 people who were passengers on the bus, and 15 of them died, and those names haven't been released. So we don't know much more, but we do know that they were seniors, and perhaps that is part of the reason why. I'm not sure. These lives are not considered as valuable, but Nora, you had, as you spoke about years ago, the way that lives are valued in this country certainly had an impact on why the Humboldt crash was viewed and responded to in a particular way, and not other crashes that happen in Canada.
Yeah, and like right down to this thing that not releasing the names yet is so confounding, because as of Friday at night, all of the survivors were identified. And so everybody else on that bus who didn't survive is obviously among the victims. And one family that I've seen reported by the Winnipeg Free Press, of course, we're recording this on Sunday night, so by the time you hear this on Tuesday, maybe more names have come out. But I've seen only one name of one of the victims. It's so like, what? Like, you identified the survivors, so you know who the victims are. All the families have been notified as of Friday night, according to CBC News. And so it's like, there's no urgency. The tragedy has been very, very, very much isolated in Dauphin, the way that this has been reported. It's all like, Dauphin's a small community. The bus came from Dauphin. People there are very, very sad. And it has been very clearly localized into this community rather than externalized as we all have loved ones that go on coach buses to casinos. Like, we all have loved ones that have day trips through senior centers. We all have in the exact same way that the Humboldt crash was externalized. This was not a crash that was only impacting the families in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, right? This was something that, everybody felt connected to for various reasons. I mean, I remember a lot of the message that I got from people were like, I'm very close to the buses because I spent a lot of time on coach buses, and therefore this has affected me. And it was like, yeah, Canada's a big country. I mean, show me someone that hasn't spent a lot of time on a bus in this country. That is one of the reasons why Humboldt was so, why it touched people. But like, let's be serious. It's not the key reason. And the proof is so horrifyingly in this story.
Yeah, it really is quite awful. And if there's anyone who's listening, who's been directly affected, obviously our hearts go out to you. And this sort of failure in reporting brings up another piece of news that happened this week, one that Nora we did not discuss before turning on turning the record button on, but the cut of 1,300 jobs at Bell Media, including a bunch of the international bureaus, like just being like, fuck international news from Bell Media, cutting a bunch of radio stations, apparently also in the middle of their fucking broadcasts with no notice, giving to so many of the journalists who are fucking making the news at Bell. And I mean, fuck, like Bell turned a profit last year. Like, I don't really understand
a big profit.
What the fuck this is.
Yes. Okay. I want to wrap up the conversation about the bus accident before I unload about what I think of the Bell Media news. There's a couple of things while you're watching how this coverage is unfolding. Keep in mind, one, the far right has already started to use this to suggest that there was that the fault lies with the truck driver in the same racist way that a lot of the comments were about the truck driver in Humboldt. The news is saying that, like, based on dash cam data from the truck driver, that they had the right of way. It was probably not their fault. There's no information about who the truck driver was or who the bus driver was. But it is very interesting to see the far right very, very cynically try to use this for their own purposes. Number two, this is an intersection where people have died before. At least one person has died in the last 10 years, and someone has been in touch with me saying that they had family members die at this exact same intersection before. There's also been a lot of other crashes. And if you see the way the intersection looks, you can see perhaps why, because it's a very chaotic mix of stop signs and yield signs as two highways meet one another. And so then that brings a whole other level of questions. Just as Humboldt did, how safe are prairie crossings in this country, and how safe are these roads to the people who are driving on them? I have a friend who also just got in a very serious accident on the Trans-Canada between Brandon and Winnipeg, and it's like, what we're just so okay with destruction on the road. We're so okay with people getting hurt when they're driving, and we're actually so okay with people dying that the only reason Humboldt made the splash that it did was because of all the reasons that I talked about 5.5 years ago. That when it's anybody else other than the most vaulted members of our society, young white male hockey players, nobody cares, because death in Canada on the roads is normal and expected, and that is disgusting. And the last thing that I will say to people is, if you are on a coach bus, wear your seatbelt. If there's a seatbelt there, put it on, because I know a lot of coach buses more and more have seatbelts, and I don't know, I have no idea who was wearing or who wasn't wearing in this crash. I'm not making a connection to say that anybody wasn't or was in this situation, but do yourself a favor and put on your seatbelt if you're sitting on a coach bus that has seatbelts.
Hear, hear. Yeah, the discussion about how to make our roads safer is one that obviously it needs to come to the fore. And I hear you on that, and I think that everything that you've said makes a lot of sense. And it's just like, it's just so unbelievably tragic. And these are, in this particular situation, this is a situation where there's a bus and a truck. So that's two people who are carrying out their jobs. There are two people who are, the bus driver and the truck driver are completing work. And so this is an issue that has to do with policies, both of how the roads are, but also workplace policies and workplace safety. And these are issues for which our politicians, our political apparatus has a responsibility. And so they shouldn't just be thought of as things that are normal or have to happen on the road. We should be thinking about them in those, from those perspectives, of how we make work safe and how we make our roads safe, because it's possible to do such things. And as these crashes, as we continue to hear about these crashes, it's clear that something needs to be done about it, or someone's failing somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Okay, so Bell Media, they made more than $2 billion in profits in 2022 and are still cutting 1,300 people out of Bell Media jobs. As you said, closing international bureaus, closing the Los Angeles bureau, the London bureau, downsizing the Washington bureau, and closing all of those radio stations. It is a bloodbath. This is a company that doesn't give a fuck about the people that work for it. And this is well known. Anybody that is anywhere near the orbit of a Bell Media company will say this. And what does it do to media in this country? I mean, it just gets worse. We are then relying more and more and more on very few operators. It's bad for journalism jobs, obviously. And one thing that people need to know is that CTV News has some of the biggest coverage in Canada when you get off line, when you're looking at television, when you're looking at how many Canadians watch CTV News channels or listen to Bell Media radio stations, they have a huge reach. And so this is a disaster. And what is the most galling about it is that the federal government has been giving these companies subsidies. Bell, I mean, they took in hundreds of millions of dollars in COVID subsidies. But then there's also media, other subsidies too. And it's just like, they're like, yeah, whatever, you know what? Fuck it. We're not operating, even though we're making a profit. We're not interested in this business anymore. And what is going to happen is news is being centralized. They're creating a single newsroom, which will of course be in Toronto, which will of course pump out news that people outside of Toronto and the rest of Canada will be like, that doesn't reflect my reality. You're not pronouncing the name of that town right. Who the hell are you to tell me that? And it's just going to even further create the conditions for misinformation and disinformation and people to completely check out of mainstream news.
Yeah, I'm like the Ottawa bureau chief.
Wild, eh?
I'm sorry, you are one of the most massive news organizations in the country. You're one of the most watched national, like CP24. That's Bell Media. Like, fuck. And you're eliminating the place where like federal politics. I just don't understand. Like, you don't clearly take yourself seriously, or you just don't value news. And so I think it's probably the latter, especially if you're going to be treating your workers in such a way. I mean, these people, all of these people, some of them big names in Canadian news, not having any notice whatsoever. Like, what the fuck? Like, wow. I mean, geez, journalists in this country like really need to organize heavily, because I think, if it isn't clear this week, it should have been clear before, but fuck, nobody is safe with these people who are running the corporate news media in Canada, and your jobs aren't safe. And so this is the time to ensure that you are organizing worker power as journalists in this country, because in terms of protecting your job and protecting the news and making sure that people have access to the information that they need to be the participants in the society that they live in. And then also, I mean, it's an opportunity for those of us who are engaged in independent media creation to really think about what this moment means, like what this continuation of this trend, the gutting of news in Canada means. Because I know for myself and for you increasingly, news is not coming from the most important news isn't coming from the mainstream so much anymore. A lot of the independent media in Canada is quite frankly more valuable. And so what does that mean? How do we support that? Like, how do we see the way forward? But either way, just like really fucking stunning, outrageous news from Bell Media.
Yeah, and it also puts in perspective for me, like, I thought I've always been a bit uneasy with how the Lisa LaFlamme stuff has been totally, like, boiled down to they didn't want a 55-year-old woman on the air, and this is sexism. And it's like, these guys don't even think that deeply. Like, are you kidding me? Like that's going to be how we're going to talk about this. What Lisa LaFlamme's firing should have been was not telling women of a certain age that they're next to be fired, but actually telling journalists of a certain caliber that they don't matter. And so seeing Joyce Napier and Glenn McGregor and all of the international bureau chiefs who are like veterans in journalism, their heads rolling. It's like, wow, great. You folks just spent the last 2 years venerating, or 1.5 years venerating someone who was fired because she was a woman of a certain age, when actually the real thing was that the corporation was going to fucking come for you all. And it actually doesn't have anything to do with your ages as much as it has to do with the fact that they're consolidating the news into Toronto, and they don't want anyone in Ottawa. They don't want anyone in Los Angeles. They don't want anyone in London. And that's a disaster for the quality of our news. That's a disaster for us to have any Canadian perspective on what's going on. But you know what? Hell, when I look at the coverage of CTV and the Royal Crown, it's like, fuck, what the fuck are you even doing out there, actually? You know, like, there's that whole other cynical side of it too.
Even like also, I mean, we've named all these places where they've cut, but also, like the Washington bureau chief. It's like, really? Like fucking now? Are you sure? Like, I think like a Canadian perspective on what's happening in the United States is one, important, and two, sorry, there's a lot going on in the United States. Are you sure you don't want to have someone there? What the fuck? Bizarre.
Yeah. And it only helps people in power, right? Like the crusade against the CBC gets even more pertinent when there's fewer people writing about the federal government, because then all of a sudden it's just CBC. I mean, God, Ottawa with no CTV is like, what the fuck? Like, are you guys serious? That's so bad.
No, they're not serious.
They're not serious. They're not serious people at all. And fuck them. And yeah. And you know what, journalists, get some backbone, because guess what? Your loyalty is not going to save you, like, at all.
So next, Nora, have you seen this news coming out of Calgary of Black Lives Matter activists being targeted by the police?
I have seen it, and I actually have to shout out all of the people that made sure I saw it, because this is one of these stories where people are like, oh my God, Nora, have you fucking seen this? So I've seen it. I've seen the news.
So activists in Calgary, Taylor and Adora, who organize out of BLM YYC, have been being targeted. Well, Taylor in particular has been targeted by the police for some time now, and has been engaged in court proceedings because of being targeted by the police. But this week, both Taylor and Adora being again targeted by police. Taylor being arrested, Adora being charged with a hate crime, and then that hate crime being dropped with the police saying that it was a clerical error. And I don't know how you interpret this as anything more than tactics of intimidation by the police.
Yeah, and in Adora's case, she was charged with a hate crime for blocking access to a school. It's like, sorry, what? Like, yeah, clerical. That's an interesting backing up of the story of what happened. But the school's a Catholic school, but it's like Catholic schools are public in Alberta. So it's like, what are you talking about, Calgary police? This is so insidious, and it's obviously meant to put a chill on organizing in that city. We've seen very similar tactics of the Edmonton police legally targeting people who are critical of them. And actually, if you've listened to the Daily News this past week, there was a story of an individual who was filing a lot of freedom of information requests to the Victoria Police and the Saanich Police, and then he found out that they were instantly looking him up in the police database. Which he managed to get through freedom of information again. And the Office of the Privacy Commissioner looked into it and condemned the two police departments. This is so dangerous. And I mean, solidarity, obviously, with Taylor and Adora, but also police out of control. What the hell is going on here? This is ridiculous.
Yeah, this is outrageous. And what I think, there is a campaign to raise money for these two activists, but also folks should know that this sort of thing is only able to occur when people are lacking in support. And I think, I've said this on this podcast before. I think that in recent times, activists or people who would normally, be out there on the front lines there's been a chill on our organizing. There's been some fear. I think that people are nervous to be doxxed, to be targeted. And that the insidious thing about the way that works, the way that fear works, is that the more of us who are impacted by that fear and let that fear stop us from taking some sort of action, the more effective the doxing and the targeting becomes. And so this sort of thing is only possible. This sort of thing is only possible in terms of harming these activists and becomes more possible when there's just not enough people around supporting them publicly, supporting them loudly. And so if you have heard about this, whether you have or not, please speak out and support these folks. And we will put in the show notes information as to where you can donate some funds if you are interested in supporting these activists.
Totally. Next, the Safe Third Country Agreement was in the news this past week. As Sandy, you alluded to earlier in the show, it was not on the front page of the Globe and Mail. The Supreme Court has made a pretty big decision on something that people have been waiting for now for quite a long time, on this agreement that Canada uses to shield itself from having to process refugee claims that are coming from people who are entering Canada from the United States, because it is a safe third country, according to Canada. And the Supreme Court has upheld the agreement, kinda. Is that the best way to explain it?
Yeah, upheld the agreement, kinda. So if you have seen the headlines, you've probably seen that. I mean, many of the headlines just read that the Supreme Court upheld the agreement, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. The Supreme Court upheld that the agreement does not violate Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So Section 7 being the one that guarantees people the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. But the court did think that it was that the challengers made a compelling argument that it could violate Section 15 of the Charter, and so sent it back to the lower court to make a determination on that. So there is still a possibility that the Safe Third Country Agreement could be found unconstitutional. But I mean, fucking regardless, the decision that it doesn't violate Section 7 is it's just so strange to me that that is the decision that can be made. The United States, a safe third country with everything the fuck that's going on. We know that it's not a safe country for many people, and it wouldn't be a safe country for certain types of refugee claimants. So, I mean, I don't know why we would hand over that sort of the ability to make that sort of decision making, or the ability to make that sort of determination, unless, of course, we ourselves were not interested in actually adjudicating these refugee claims. That's not the interest here. That we, in fact, what we're trying to do with this agreement is to reduce the amount of refugee claims that are going to be heard at all. And what does that make us? I mean, that's what's clearly happening here. And so, and the court is acting as a willing participant in that agenda.
Yeah, exactly. This whole law, as you say, exists to shield Canada from having to actually adjudicate asylum claims. And, there's one thing about the United States, whether or not it in and of itself is a safe country for people. But the other question is the refugee and asylum claiming process even good, you know, like, or what happens if you go all the way through the United States and you come to Canada and you haven't applied for asylum status in the United States? We still consider you coming from the United States because it's like, well, by virtue of what? Like geography, that you happen to be on foot and you're coming from Mexico, and therefore you must apply for asylum in the United States. You can't skip over the country and come to Canada. Like, what does that mean for people who first go to Mexico and don't apply for asylum in Mexico? Like, is Canada, United States, like, well, should have done it in Mexico. We're not accepting you here. Like, it's so weaselly and so gross, and especially gross considering how many people have died as a result of these policies, because the Safe Third Country Agreement is what has pushed people to irregularly cross the border. Because you cannot show up at an official port of entry and say, I just came here from the United States and I want to claim asylum. You will be processed, but you will be processed as someone who's coming from the United States. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but the reality is that it's pushed thousands and thousands of people to cross through irregular border crossings that have been unsafe. There have been 8 people died recently on the water trying to cross between the United States and Canada through Akwesasne. There have been there's a family that died in Manitoba. There are individuals that die all the time. And for the Supreme Court to say that this does not represent a violation of life, liberty, and the security of person is like, sorry, then what the fuck does? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's interesting that they've taken this half-measure approach, telling the lower court to figure out whether or not it's violating Section 15. But it's like, guys, like, literally the law is forcing people to do dangerous and deadly things. And if we got rid of the Safe Third Country Agreement, they could just apply through the regular ports of entry, like on the road, in a car. What the fuck?
Yeah, and for those folks who would look at this and say, what, you know, like the type of really disgusting and gross justifications that you hear from the sort of fascist political bend, that this is like, you know, these people need to get in line or are just trying to, like, people should know, like, the folks who are attempting these crossings, like, they are aware of how dangerous it is. Like, they know how dangerous it is. They know that they may not survive. They know that they may be detained. They know that their life is going to be markedly hard, like very, very, very difficult as a result of attempting this. So think about what they must be trying to escape. To make the decision that you will risk your life, you know you're going to risk your life to do this. Like, it's to look at that sort of situation and be like, no, get in line, or like whatever the sort of the weird sort of thinking that you have to look at that situation and think this is all totally justified. I don't know, man. It's really fucked up, and this is a really a terrible decision. It's going to result in more people being harmed, and I really do hope that for you know, those lawyers, for those organizations that made the argument that the Safe Third Country Agreement, because that the U.S. Has denied refugee status to many people fleeing gender-based persecution, and so as a result, it's not a safe third country when it comes. It's not that the Safe Third Country Agreement violates Section 15. You know, I really hope that argument does win the day.
Yeah. And of course, the backdrop to all of this is like global migration is on the rise, right? There's hundreds of thousands of people who fled Ukraine. Everyone knows that. There's also been hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Sudan and trying to get to safer places as the civil war is waging between Sudanese armies and the RSF. And of course, those are not the only two places. There's people that are fleeing economic strife and environmental related disaster. And when you look at Europe, where a lot of people are crossing the Mediterranean and they're dying, you know, in the last week, a boat of 500 people capsized. It says that there's 100 people there are 100 children in the hold of the ship, and only 78 have been confirmed dead, but the rest of the ship is missing. And so we look at that in Canada by virtue of the fact that we are just physically further away than other parts of the world, that to come to Canada either by air or by boat is difficult. And the most normal way to get to this country with our massive border is through the United States. And so that's exactly the way that we have to remember this agreement, is to just stop people from being able to come here. I mean, it's not even a queue jumping thing, right? It's like, if you are on foot and you're coming from the south, you have to cross the United States. And if Canada says, sorry, you got to stay in the United States because we consider the United States a safe third country, like that's just that's an affront to liberty. That's saying to people that they must settle in the United States. And you know what? Frankly, like maybe it's better in the United States. There is cross-border migration, and a lot of people are leaving Canada and going to the United States. Of course, they have the same agreement as we do, and so it'll be interesting to see, you know, what happens if those cases climb at all. But it's like we have no desire to be involved in helping people in this world who are looking to have a different location for their lives. We have no desire of that, and this piece of shit legislation is proof of that. And I don't know. It's like, fuck the Supreme Court on this decision. This sucks.
Yeah. And then it's just like, and just the other thing, I mean, I know I already said this, but I just want to put a finer point on it. Like, the politics in the US right now are all over the fucking place. Like, we have no idea what is safe in any state, because quite frankly, the power of the federal government, the states, especially in red states, have been taking a lot more power back. So there's that in terms of safety. Like, you don't really know what's going on in the political situation. And then obviously it's a hugely polarized place. And depending on who's elected where, things swing in one direction or another. So how could you make the determination that this is a safe country? Like, it doesn't make any lick of sense. And again, I don't know why we would cede the ability to make that determination. Well, I know why.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I feel like the news this episode has been pretty depressing. Sandy, do you got like a good news story?
I do. And I did allude to this one earlier as well. So I think that we absolutely must talk about the amazing organizing of the International Youth Student Organization, who have been a student group who has been organizing to stop the deportations of international students who were facing deportation after having found out that they were defrauded by organizations who sent them letters when they were applying to attend school in Canada when they were from their countries of origin, sent them letters of acceptances from Canadian schools that were fraudulent. And so many of these students, not knowing that, were able to come to Canada based on these letters, and then later found out while applying for permanent residency that not only were those letters fraudulent, but that they might be facing deportation by the CBSA. So even though those letters were fraudulent, for many of those students who arrived on Canadian soil, they just applied to other schools or ended up going to school elsewhere and continuing on their lives. And so many of those students would have been in Canada for some time and are now facing the consequences of these fraudulent actors. And so students decided to get together and organize against these deportations.
Yes, yeah. I want to shout out as well the Naujawan Support Network. They've been helping to keep me updated on what's going on too. And then there's a lot of folks with Spring Magazine. I've been watching the reporting from them. This is one of those cases where it's like, I can't believe it took so much work to get them to convince the government to do the most basic thing. Like there has been 24-hour encampments. There has been nonstop protesting. We're talking about a couple hundred Indian international students who were all getting these deportation orders because of these fraudulent educational documents. 8 students had already been deported. And the committee, the parliamentary committee, unanimously said that they supported putting a stay to the deportations, but they don't actually have the power to do that, which is also very interesting. And then finally, they pushed Sean Fraser, who's the Minister of Immigration, to and CBSA to stay the deportations. Now, it's a temporary victory, but it's like none of this is their fault. Like, why would we be deporting them? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, not only has like time kind of passed on the, this document is fraudulent. Like, no, these folks have been in the country for a couple of years now. And it's now that CBSA is like, oh shit, you came under false pretenses. I don't care about the education you've got ever since. I don't care that you've got enough education that you're now applying for jobs. Get out of Canada. Like, whose interest is that in? Whose interest does that serve? It's so absurd and it's so ridiculous. So, like, amazing victory, but God, like, why would it even take fighting for this? Like, why didn't like an adult in government be like, wait a minute, okay, this doesn't make any sense. We're not going to go ahead with deporting these students.
Yeah, but I got to say, like, the organizing that came out of this, these students, and how creative they were and how dogged they were in refusing to let this go and refusing to give up. This is the type of organizing that results in carrying out what some folks may believe is the impossible. And to stop deportations, what a phenomenal victory. And it also is, it should have us thinking about our education system and how internationally the entirety of our education system, how we rely on international students, how international students are recruited, and then they become reliant on people to help them through the process, and how able they are to be exploited, whether that's through the universities and colleges that support them on a regular basis, the governments who exploit them by making sure that they're paying exorbitant fees to come here, or in this particular situation, how they're being defrauded by these agencies. The education system has a lot to answer for. And, it would have been great to see some of those educational institutions be a part of this fight back. But it's the students who really got together to do this. And the radical reporting by the outlet Spring Mag, really amazing work. And I think that should serve as some inspiration to those of us who, we've been hearing from you, have been feeling really kind of down on organizing. The possibilities are there, and there's a lot of people to learn from. And so, reach out to these groups potentially and see what you can hear, what you can learn from their organizing experience and how they made this happen. Because rest assured, it was them who made this happen. And congratulations to all of you.
Totally. And also, as they say, it's not over. They're also demanding that the government compensate these students for the incredible stress that they've been under while they face deportation. And of course, that puts your life completely into pause. You can't do anything if you think that you have to fight a deportation order. And then, the schools. Universities and colleges, publicly funded universities and colleges, have treated international students for so long, just so horribly, that, buildings should be occupied over it. People should be harassed out of jobs over it. And we just have accepted it. If folks listening to the Daily News last week will remember that I mentioned this theory that it's international students that are driving the housing crisis in smaller cities that have universities and colleges. And the way that the international students were even conceived of in this was they're well off enough to pay for these higher educational fees or tuition fees. They are going to the mainstream schools, publicly funded college or university. But underneath all of that is also very sketchy private colleges operating that government has no interest in really regulating. And they're the ones that are benefiting from a lack of oversight, and they're the ones that are putting these students into danger, frankly. So it's this combination between the public and the private, the public having a responsibility to do something, as you say, not at all doing something. So no matter where you are, if you're a student in this country, this is something that you absolutely can get involved in, because there's no shortage of examples of the oppression and the exploitation of international students by private and public college and university operators. Sandy, now we are about finished. I just have to mention that diarrhea guzzling tweet. It's got more than 600 likes.
That's outrageous. You're outrageous. You're ridiculous.
Correct.
It's a privilege to work with you.